In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. I think exactly 1 month ago, I was at scout camp in the Adirondack area at Camp Reed with my younger son. And one of the activities that we did 1 month ago was a rodeo. We went to see a rodeo, and I have to tell you that it was my first rodeo. So now I can say forever that when I go back to a rodeo, this is not my first rodeo. This is not my first time in the pulpit, but there was a time that seems somewhat long ago at this point when I preached my first sermon. My first sermon in a church was at St. James in Fairhaven, which is in New Haven. And prior to that, I had preached some semblance of that same sermon in seminary to students. And for the record, my first sermon happened to be the night after. Sometimes timing doesn't always line up. And we had gotten, my wife Nicole and I and a friend of ours, Rob, had gotten Rolling Stones tickets for Saturday, September, whatever it was, at what was then Giant Stadium. It's before the new stadium was there. And it was in 2002 on the Licks tour, for what that's worth. And I ended up driving to New Jersey on Saturday night and then driving back to New Haven, dropping Rob and Nicole off in the city and preaching my first sermon with not a whole lot of sleep. So I can't tell you what the sermon really was about. But I do remember, and it's another strangely linked to that, I do remember the first time I was asked to preach in some way, shape, or form. And it was actually at my Commission on Ministry Discernment Conference. And this would have been, I think, in the spring of 2001. The Discernment Conference is something, if you are interested in ordination and you get through your parish and are sponsored by your parish, eventually you get brought to this terrifying diocesan commission meeting where you're interviewed. And I was in front of a table of people, and Barbara Crafton said, "Preach us a sermon." And I said, "I've never preached any sermon. I don't know what I'm doing." And she said, "Well, if you want to become a priest, you probably should be able to go forward on this." And I said, "I don't even really know where to begin." And she said, "Well, in your materials, you like the Rolling Stones. So somehow match up the Rolling Stones and Jesus." And I knocked it out of the park. I actually think it was something about sinners and saints, if you know some of their songs. And I think I used some of the same material for my first sermon in New Haven. But anyway, so it's not my first rodeo, nor is it my first sermon. And I think each of us gets to a point in our lives where we have to make that leap to be able to speak about our faith. I say this in the context of today's gospel. We are celebrating the Feast of the Transfiguration. It always falls on August 6th. If you are regularly in church, you may think, I feel like we do the Transfiguration more often than just once every couple of years on August 6th when it happens to fall on a Sunday. And we do. The Sunday before Ash Wednesday every year, the last Sunday after the Feast of the Epiphany, usually falls in February. We always read the Transfiguration. So you've probably heard this passage a whole bunch of times. It's a linking of lots of scriptural imagery from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures. You have Moses, Elijah. If you know your scriptures, you know that Moses went up on a mountain where he met with God, the Ten Commandments, the tablets, all of that up on a mountain. You know that Elijah went up on a mountain as well, where he encountered God. That reading about the still small voice that you may remember, that's Elijah on the mountain, or the sound of sheer silence in the newer translations. So people historically encounter God on a mountain. Where does this scene happen? On a mountain. Who's there? Moses and Elijah are there. There's a voice from heaven which echoes what we hear at Jesus' baptism. All of this is designed to highlight the fact, including Jesus turning dazzling. All of this is designed to highlight for the disciples who are there and for us the ideal mountaintop moment of clarity where we recognize Jesus not just as someone like Moses or Elijah who encounters God, but someone who is even more so, God incarnate on this mountain. And I think to his credit, St. Peter wants to stay and hang out. I preached many years ago about how we can't keep God in a box, and I know that that's a perfectly legitimate interpretation of Peter trying to build these little dwelling places. But as I've gotten older and preached on this more and more often, I think actually Peter's heart is very much in the right place. And if you remember your Old Testament scriptures, in the wilderness, the people set up tents, which is exactly what Peter is trying to do, to be with God as they moved around. And there was a really special tent, which was the tabernacle. And so I think Peter is in line with this, thinking, well, if this is truly where we've encountered God, then let's do the tent thing and let's stay here. And I think the reason he's not correct is because at this point we no longer encounter God only in one place or on one mountain or in one temple, but we encounter God in Jesus Christ and also in all of the children of God who get to share, like Jesus, in proclaiming God as our Father. So we encounter God all over the place. So we don't build a tent in one place, we get to move out from there. But what strikes me, and linking back into the whole my first sermon, my first rodeo thing, is this business at the end, where all of this amazing stuff has happened. And it ends when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent. And in those days, they told no one any of the things they had seen. Some of you may remember or may have seen, there's a great list of, there's one with Garrison Keillor, there's another one with Robin Williams, which is the sort of top 10 reasons why people are Episcopalian, or the top 10 ways you can identify an Episcopalian. One of them is if you're watching a Star Wars movie and you hear, "May the Force be with you," Episcopalians will reply back, "and also with you." Right? Another one is it can be 95 degrees out and totally humid, and you can identify the Episcopalians because they're drinking hot coffee. Right? There's a bunch of them. Another one is, how do you know that Peter and James and John were Episcopalians? Well, because after their mountaintop moment, they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. I've been an Episcopalian my whole life, and let me tell you, that is so right up my alley and everybody else's, probably to a degree, in the Episcopal Church. We, in general, are uncomfortable speaking about our faith to people. Case in point. I'm on the ordination track, and the first time I had even thought about a sermon was getting in front of the Commission on Ministry. We tend not to like to speak about our faith. And I would like to submit to you two things. On the one hand, we're in good company because Peter and James and John, they kept silent. They didn't know what to say. They had not yet figured out how to speak about Jesus. There's a whole bunch of passages where Jesus tells them not to say anything. It is only after they've experienced Jesus in a way that is not just in his earthly ministry, not just in his teachings, but seeing and living into and believing the risen Lord, that suddenly everything changes. And you get the disciples switching from simply followers, that's what that word disciple means, to apostles who are sent out. That's what that word means. They are sent out by Jesus now to speak about what they have seen and what they have heard. And we get that throughout the Gospels, and we even get it in this wonderful little snippet of a letter from St. Peter where he recounts the Transfiguration. So at some point, we're reading it today, so at some point somebody decided to talk, right? I watched yesterday, I'm a big fan of mafia movies for what that's worth, and I watched several movies over the weekend about Whitey Bulger. I grew up in Boston, and there's a lot to be that comes up in these movies about saying nothing to nobody. You can find some comfort in the reality that Peter and James and John said nothing to nobody. But that did not last. Their faith in Jesus eventually got them to a point where they were comfortable and inspired by the Holy Spirit and pushed by Jesus, pushed by the Spirit, pushed by God to actually start saying something about their faith in Jesus. And I encourage you, wherever you are in your spiritual journey, to take that leap of faith to start speaking about your faith. Maybe you're doing it a little bit here and there. It's a good start. Maybe you're still at the point where you've got the mountaintop moment, but you're not sure what to say. Maybe you're further down the road. Wherever you are, we are all called to get out of that comfort zone of just bottling up our feelings and what we think about God, and to move to a point where we begin to speak and act and live our faith in a way that publicly proclaims the love of God and Jesus Christ to those around us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy